So I've been watching the Book of Boba Fett recently, and I've been getting really into that. And if there's one thing I really like about that show, beyond just like the obvious plot and everything that's going on in the show, I really have fallen in love with the main title theme of the whole show. Maybe it's probably because I have a very soft spot for men's choirs. It's probably that. Let's be honest, it's probably that. But there is something that just feels really inspiring about the whole piece, the whole song, the whole theme, whatever terminology you want to use to describe it, because I don't even know at this point. But there's something just so inspiring to me, and I really wanted to know if there was any kind of like background information or inspiration behind the piece, and just kind of see where the composer was coming from, because the composer for this title theme, and only the title theme, is Ludwig Göransson. The composer for the rest of the music in the whole show is Joseph Shirley, so two different people wrote it. But Ludwig Göransson has been doing a lot of work with the recent Star Wars shows and doing a lot of the composing for the music of that, and has been taking Star Wars in a very different musical direction that I really am enjoying. And of course, I could find a whole bunch of interviews on Göransson talking about his previous work, Göransson talking about the stuff he's done for The Mandalorian, but as of right now, it doesn't seem like he's really come out to talk too much about the music that he wrote for the Book of Boba Fett. Maybe it's because he didn't write most of the music, he only wrote the title theme, not really sure, but I couldn't really find a specific interview with him talking about that title theme that he wrote. I did, on the other hand, find a lot of people speculating on the internet, talking about maybe where his inspiration was coming from, or inspiration that they kind of picked up on and that they speculated may have had inspiration on the overall piece. Some people mentioned that they could hear a very strong Polynesian feel, thought that maybe it was a nod to Temuera Morrison, who plays Boba Fett, since he himself is New Zealand Maori. Some people thought that no, maybe it was a stronger Scandinavian feel, which would make sense since Göransson himself is Swedish, and so would have that kind of Scandinavian influence. There was even one person I saw that kind of mentioned that didn't feel like it was either Polynesian or Scandinavian, that gave them kind of a sort of Mesoamerican feel. I don't know how I feel about that one per se, but analyzing and looking at all these different influences left me with more questions than I had in the first place. So I did a little bit more digging, and it turns out there is a correct answer here, and the most obvious influence for the theme of the Book of Boba Fett comes from a 1984 film, Ronja Rövardotter, or Ronja the Robber's Daughter, which is a Swedish film from the mid-80s. And in this film there is a specific piece that is being sung by the whole cast, which, yeah, if you listen to it side by side, it is the exact inspiration. There's no doubt about that. And it makes a lot of sense given that Göransson himself is Swedish. But then I thought about all the theories and speculations again. Why did everybody so strongly hear all these Scandinavian, Polynesian, Mesoamerican, all these folk and indigenous influences from a variety of cultures, which should not be sounding similar to one another? Why were people getting that kind of influence from this song, even though it's not really specifically based on one particular culture or another, it's sort of just based off of the music from another movie? Why were people getting such a strong folk and indigenous feel to this piece? What is this theme getting so right about folk and indigenous music? So I decided to kind of go through the whole song and pick out what main elements I could find that really had what I would consider to be folk or indigenous influences or roots. Now keep in mind, I'm not saying that Göransson was inspired by these cultures. Göransson explicitly put in these influences. This is explicitly where he got it from. This is more just me saying, here's the influences I'm hearing, here's potential inspiration I'm hearing, and whether it was intentional or not, here's a variety of elements that I'm picking up on that I can identify with real life cultures from around the world. Although, to be fair, even though Göransson hasn't said anything specifically, it could still get influence from these various cultures, but we just haven't gotten any explicit information. This is more just what I'm noticing. So with all of that out of the way, let me point out the things that I myself am noticing about this theme. So the first sort of few more, I would say, generic influences are things such as the drums, things such as it has a pretty simplistic form. I might even go as far to say potentially like the minor sounding key of it. I think in their own way, each of these elements have sort of become shorthand for sounding like folk or indigenous music, either with generic drums or minor sounding key, or the overall structure of the song is relatively simplistic. I think these elements are tied with a variety of different cultures to the extent where if you put them in any kind of song, you can give it a generic folk/indigenous feel. But I don't think there's any specific tie to any kind of culture with these elements because, like I said, they're so broad. Which, to be fair, the other more specific elements I'm going to talk about could also be tied to a variety of cultures, but these are the ones that I feel like aren't super strongly associated with one culture over another. The next sort of element I noticed is, I think, where a lot of people are picking up on that obvious Polynesian influence, because it's one of the first things you hear when you start to listen to the song, right? It's this big shouting chant that you hear from the men's chorus. Now, again, while shouting and chanting is in nearly every culture across the world, people, I think, most strongly associate this with Maori culture from New Zealand. And I think especially because Temuera Morrison himself is Maori. So I think a lot of people are picking up on that Maori sort of potential influence. But one of the most famous elements of Maori culture is their haka, or their Haka Dance, which is a very specific ceremonial dance/chant where the dancers do a lot of stomping, a lot of clapping, a lot of body slapping. You've probably seen this if you've ever watched like the setup to a soccer match between Team New Zealand and somebody else. The New Zealand soccer teams are pretty well known for performing the haka before a lot of their soccer games, where they just kind of stand up in a line, they perform these big ceremonial dances, and sort of as a pretending to intimidate the other team. The haka itself is most strongly associated as sort of a pre-war intimidation kind of tactic, but it's also performed in a variety of social function. It's not always for intimidation, sometimes it's for honoring people, sometimes it's for protest, sometimes it's for a lot of different kinds of things. But the big element with this haka is the big, loud, strong chants and the big sort of strong beats with the stomping and the shouting and the body movements that go along with it. The next element I pick up on, which only comes a couple bars later, is after the shouting and chanting, there comes a lot of singing. But if you listen to what's being sung in the main theme, you'll notice that it's nonsense words. It's not any specific lyrics. It's not like they're singing anything about Boba Fett or any of the other characters in the show. It's all a lot of nonsense words. And we do actually have a term for these nonsense words. They're often called vocables. And vocables are a strong part of a variety of indigenous cultures. Now, vocables in their broadest sense can just mean, like I said, anything like nonsense words. So singing la 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 or na 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 to a song is itself a vocable. But in cultures like Native American cultures or in the Sami people of Scandinavia, they use a lot of vocables in their traditional songs. In Native American cultures, vocables are used a lot in traditional songs, either as a form of being onomatopoeia to represent the sound of something, whether it be like an animal or a specific object that the sound it might make, or it's used in place of words as sort of a call out, either maybe to a specific god or just as a generic form of self-expression, where you don't want to use any kind of words, you just kind of want to call out in a raw sort of way from your soul. This is very, very, very common in a lot of Native American music, and not just from one specific tribe either. With the Sami people of Scandinavia, singing with vocables is often a specific genre called the yoik. In a very similar fashion to how Native Americans use vocables as a form of self-expression, the Sami people use vocables in the yoik as part of, again, self-expression, and see it as a very, very personal sort of thing. Yoik is used in a large variety of social functions. There's not really one specific thing that it's tied to. And they also view it as a song that doesn't really have any specific beginning or specific end. They see yoik music as sort of paralleling nature in the fact that it's in this constant and continuous cycle. So when you sing the yoik, you might kind of suddenly start and then suddenly stop. There's not a specific beginning and ending to the piece. You're probably likely also familiar with a song that was structured after the yoik in Eight Vueli from Disney's Frozen, also known as the opening piece that they have. But alongside these vocables that are being sung by the choir, you'll also notice that in the title theme for Boba Fett, that it has this sort of irregular time signature. For a good chunk of it, it is what feels like 6/8, but outside of that main portion when the choir sings, when the chanting's going on, or when the instruments are playing, it feels like what I would probably identify as being in 11/8. You can feel 3 sections of 3 followed by 1 section of 2. And yet again, this can be another common element in a lot of folk music. Specifically, if you're talking about sort of Eastern Europe / the Balkans area, a lot of music from this region is in what they'd call an irregular time signature. So basically anything that's not like 4/4, 6/8, 3/4, a lot of the time signatures that we use in our Western culture. You probably already knew this if you're familiar with any of Béla Bartok's music, especially if you've heard any of his Microcosmos before. Béla Bartok was a famous ethnomusicologist, probably one of the first ethnomusicologists from the early 20th century, and he spent a lot of time going around and recording the music of the folk cultures of Hungary, as well as some of the surrounding countries like Bulgaria or Romania, and he spent a lot of time recording the songs of these people and gathering them all together for preservation and for studying purposes. And a lot of the songs that he wrote were highly based on the folk music of the people of these countries. So I bring up Bartok's Microcosmos because in that piece there are a lot of smaller sub-pieces that are in these irregular time signatures. In fact, there's even one called 6 Dances in a Bulgarian Rhythm, which has an irregular time signature. But if you were to ask the people of these cultures what's the time signature of your piece, they wouldn't tell you anything because that's not how they think of their own music. They don't think of it in terms of how many beats are in a section, how many beats are within a measure. They think of them as long beats or short beats. So what might be what we would call like a 7/8 time signature would be to them 2 short beats followed by 1 long beat. So if we take this back to the example of the Boba Fett main theme, 11/8 is more like what they would call 3 long beats followed by 1 short beat. And then for the 6/8 section would just all be long beats, or you could probably group it up into 2 sections of 2 long beats. And the last main element that I really noticed was a lot of polyphonic singing. Now, polyphonic writing in folk culture, again, pretty common element that you see pop up. I mean, early classical music had a lot of polyphonic writing to it. So it is an element that you would expect, and it's not super uncommon. But there is one culture that really dominates to this day in writing a lot of polyphonic music, and that is the music of the country of Georgia. Again, in that sort of Eastern European sphere, but slightly different than like the Balkans kind of area. And with Georgian polyphonic music, there are sort of 3 distinct different types that you'll probably find. One called complex polyphony, one that's like a polyphonic line over sort of like a bass drone, and one called contrasting polyphony where it's 3 lines that are somewhat improvising and on their own separate from one another. I would say the vocal writing that's being used in the Book of Boba Fett is more of that contrasting polyphony rather than the other two, because it is these three distinct separate lines. You can hear a bass line that's different from the middle line, which is different from the main melodic tenor line. They're all very independent of each other. And even though they're probably not truly improvised, it does have that kind of sound to it. The thing I would say is really different about this theme versus the actual traditions that I've been talking about in the singing realm of this is that most of the singing folk and indigenous music tends to be a cappella, whereas clearly in this theme it's not. There's instruments in the background, and I think that's more of what our Western ears want to be hearing when we hear a main title theme. We want to hear all the instruments that come along with it, not just the voices by itself. But I think including these different elements and weaving them in there, like I said, whether it's intentional or not, is really what makes this main theme have this folk/indigenous sound to it. I also think it's very fitting given the whole plot of what the Book of Boba Fett is going for. Little spoiler alert if you haven't seen anything and want to stay completely out of any news, but I think the whole arc that they had with the Tusken Raiders really fits well with the main theme that Göransson has written for the Book of Boba Fett. It sort of gives this feel that Boba Fett has gone back to his roots in some way. It sort of feels like a nod to the culture of the Tusken Raiders, and it really helps solidify this sort of angle that they're going for of building from the ground up. And so I think Göransson did a really good job of kind of having that overall theme and aesthetic that you can tell the show is also angling for. I think he did a good job of translating that into the music. So what are your thoughts on the theme? Do you like it? Do you not like it? I like this theme a lot. I don't know if I like it. I think I like it about the same as I do the Mandalorian theme, although I'm not sure. I think I like that one just a little bit more. This one has definitely grown on me an awful lot, but I don't know, it's really hard to compete with the Mandalorian theme that he originally wrote for that first series. But yeah, tell me what your thoughts are on it. Do you agree with my assessment of this? Do you have anything else you noticed? Do you like this music? Do you not like this music? Leave me your thoughts and comments down below in the comment box and type in there whatever you want to type me. But that's all I had for this week's video. So of course, if you like this video, you'd like to see more of it, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Goodbye!